spooky place.
Welcome back to the spooky place, where the stories don't just scare you, they follow you. Tonight, we share a tale whispered around dying embers, a story that doesn't just unsettle, it haunts. Once you hear it, you won't sleep. Not tonight, not ever, because some stories don't fade when the fire dies. They linger, lurking in the silence, waiting in the darkness. And once it has your attention, it never lets go. So listen closely, but not too closely. Because if you do, this story might just listen back. The Midnight Game. It was a cold, moonless night when 5 teenagers gathered in the dimly lit basement of an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and the only light came from a single flickering bulb that swung lazily from the ceiling. The group had come to play the Midnight Game, an old ritual they had found on a dark corner of the internet. The rules were simple. Write your name on a piece of paper, prick your finger to draw a drop of blood, and place the paper on the floor. At exactly midnight, you knock on the door 22 times, blow out a candle, and invite the Midnight Man into your world. The goal was to survive until 3:33 a.m. without being caught by the shadowy entity. If you failed, the consequences were said to be dire. The group, Emma, Jake, Sarah, Tyler, and Mia, had laughed off the warnings, treating it as just another spooky game to pass the time. But as the clock struck midnight and the first knock echoed through the basement, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature dropped, and the candle's flame flickered wildly before extinguishing, plunging the room into darkness. The only sound was the faint ticking of an old clock, counting down the hours until 3:33 a.m. At first, it seemed like nothing would happen. They joked nervously, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over them. But then the lights began to flicker, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. A low, guttural whisper filled the air, though no one dared to speak. Emma, the most skeptical of the group, was the first to feel it, a cold, unseen hand brushing against her arm. She screamed, and the others turned to her, their faces pale with fear. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her voice trembling. The others nodded, their bravado crumbling as the reality of the situation set in. They were not alone. The next hour was a blur of terror. The group stayed close together, clutching their candles and matches as they moved through the house, trying to avoid the Midnight Man. But no matter where they went, the entity seemed to follow. The shadows grew darker, more menacing, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. One by one, they felt the cold touch of unseen hands, the sensation growing more intense with each encounter. Jake was the first to vanish. He had been standing near the staircase when the lights flickered again. When they came back on, he was gone. The others called his name, but there was no response. Only the sound of his footsteps echoing from somewhere above, growing fainter and fainter until they disappeared entirely. Panic set in as the group realized the game was no longer a game. They tried to leave, but the doors and windows were sealed shut, as if the house itself had become a prison. The clock continued to tick, each second bringing them closer to 3:33 a.m. Sarah was next. She had been holding the candle when it suddenly went out, plunging the room into darkness. When the light returned, she was gone, leaving only her candle and a faint trail of blood on the floor. Tyler and Mia clung to each other, their fear palpable as they searched for a way out. But the house seemed to shift and change around them, the hallways stretching endlessly, the walls closing in. Emma, desperate to survive, tried to remember the rules of the game. She recalled that the Midnight Man could be warded off with salt, but they had none. She also remembered that the entity could not cross a line of blood, but the thought of cutting herself made her stomach churn. As the clock struck 3 a.m., she made a decision. She grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor and sliced her palm, drawing a line of blood across the doorway. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, but the Midnight Man did not cross the threshold. For a moment, Emma thought she had one, but then she heard Tyler scream. She turned to see him being dragged into the shadows by an unseen force, his eyes wide with terror as he disappeared into the darkness. Mia tried to run, but the shadows closed in around her, swallowing her whole. Emma was alone now, the clock ticking down the final minutes. She could feel the Midnight Man's presence all around her, the air thick with malice. She clutched the shard of glass in her hand, her only weapon against the entity. As the clock struck 3:33 a.m., the whispers stopped and the house fell silent. But the silence was worse than the whispers. Emma could feel the Midnight Man's gaze on her, cold and unyielding. She closed her eyes, waiting for the end, but it never came. When she opened her eyes, she was standing outside the house, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. She was alive, but she knew the Midnight Man had not let her go. He had marked her, and he would return. The others were never found. The police searched the house, but there was no trace of Jake, Sarah, Tyler, or Mia. Emma tried to tell them what had happened, but they dismissed her story as the ramblings of a traumatized teenager. She knew the truth, though. The Midnight Man was real, and he was still out there, waiting for his next game. Years passed, and Emma tried to move on with her life. But she could never escape the feeling of being watched, the cold touch of unseen hands brushing against her skin in the dead of night. She knew the Midnight Man was still with her, biding his time, and when the clock struck midnight, she could still hear the whispers, calling her name, inviting her to play again. The Midnight Game was never just a game. It was a pact, a contract with the shadows, and once you played, there was no escape. The Midnight Man always won. Emma thought she had escaped the Midnight Man. She thought the dawn had saved her, but as the years passed, the shadows clung to her like a second skin, and the whispers never truly left. She moved to a new city, changed her name, and tried to bury the past. But some things cannot be buried. Some things are alive, waiting in the dark. It was on her 25th birthday that the nightmares returned with a vengeance. She woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. The image of the Midnight Man burned into her mind. His form was no longer just a shadow. It had shape now, a grotesque silhouette with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth. He was no longer content to linger in the corners of her mind. He wanted her back. That night, she found a piece of paper on her doorstep. It was old, yellowed, and smelled of decay. On it was written her name, her real name, in blood. Beneath it were the words, "You didn't finish the game." Her heart raced as she crumpled the paper and threw it away. But the next morning, it was back on her doorstep, pristine and unblemished, as if it had never been touched. The following days were a blur of paranoia. She saw him everywhere, in the reflection of her bathroom mirror, in the flicker of a street lamp, in the corner of her eye as she walked down the street. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until she could no longer tell if they were in her head or coming from the shadows themselves. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard it, a knock on her door. Not the soft, tentative knock of a neighbor, but a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap that sent chills down her spine. She counted them, 22. Her blood turned to ice. She knew what came next. The lights in her apartment flickered, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that she could see her breath in the air. The candle she kept on her nightstand, a habit she had never been able to break, sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers became a cacophony, overlapping voices that spoke in languages she didn't understand, yet somehow knew were meant for her. "Emma," one voice hissed. "You can't hide forever." She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed the police. But the call didn't go through. Instead, she heard static, and then a voice, deep, guttural, and dripping with malice. "The game isn't over." She threw the phone across the room and scrambled out of bed, her mind racing. She needed salt, something to ward him off. But as she ran to the kitchen, the floor beneath her seemed to shift, the walls elongating and twisting until she was no longer in her apartment, but back in the abandoned house where it had all begun. The basement was exactly as she remembered it. The flickering bulb, the scent of decay, the oppressive silence broken only by the ticking of the clock. And there, in the center of the room, stood the Midnight Man. His form was more solid now, his hollow eyes fixed on her, his jagged mouth curled into a grotesque smile. "You left too soon," he said, his voice echoing as if it came from all directions at once. "The game must be finished." Emma backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "I'm not playing your game anymore," she stammered, though her voice lacked conviction. The Midnight Man tilted his head, his smile widening. "You don't have a choice." The shadows around him began to move, stretching and twisting until they took on familiar shapes. Jake, Sarah, Tyler, and Mia emerged from the darkness, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes hollow. They moved toward her, their movements jerky and unnatural, their mouths opening to speak in unison. "You left us," they said, their voices a chilling harmony. "Now it's your turn." Emma screamed and turned to run, but the door was gone. The walls closed in around her, the shadows reaching out like hands, pulling her toward the Midnight Man. She fought against them, but they were too strong. The clock struck 3:33 a.m., and the room was plunged into absolute darkness. When the light returned, Emma was gone. The basement was empty, save for a single piece of paper on the floor. It was old, yellowed, and smelled of decay. On it was written a new name, in blood. The Midnight Man had found his next player. Months later, a group of teenagers gathered in the basement of an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. They had come to play the Midnight Game, an old ritual they had found on a dark corner of the internet. The rules were simple. Write your name on a piece of paper, prick your finger to draw a drop of blood, and place the paper on the floor. At exactly midnight, you knock on the door 22 times, blow out a candle, and invite the Midnight Man into your world. As the clock struck midnight, the lights flickered and the shadows began to move. One of the teenagers, a girl named Lily, felt a cold hand brush against her arm. She screamed, but it was too late. The game had begun, and the Midnight Man always wins. Lily's scream echoed through the basement, but the others were too paralyzed by fear to react. The shadows seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting like serpents, and the air grew so cold that their breath turned to frost. The candle's flame flickered wildly, casting grotesque shapes on the walls, shapes that seemed to move on their own. The whispers began, low and guttural, filling the room with a language that felt ancient and wrong. One by one, the teenagers felt the cold touch of unseen hands. A boy named Mark was the first to break. He bolted for the door, but it was gone, replaced by a solid wall of darkness. He pounded on it, screaming for help, but his cries were swallowed by the void. The others watched in horror as the shadows enveloped him, pulling him into the abyss. His screams faded into silence, and he was gone. The remaining three, Lily, Chris, and Rachel, clung to each other, their faces pale and their eyes wide with terror. The clock on the wall ticked louder, each second echoing like a death knell. The Midnight Man's presence was everywhere, his hollow eyes watching from the shadows, his jagged smile promising unspeakable horrors. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were deafening. As the clock struck 3 a.m., Rachel made a desperate decision. She remembered something Emma had told her years ago, something about salt and blood. She grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor and sliced her palm, drawing a line of blood across the doorway. The whispers grew frantic, and the shadows recoiled, but the Midnight Man did not cross the threshold. For a moment, Rachel thought they might survive, but then the candle went out. The room plunged into darkness, and the whispers stopped. The silence was worse than the noise, heavy and suffocating. When the light returned, Rachel was gone. Only her blood remained, smeared across the floor in a pattern that looked eerily like a smile. Lily and Chris were the last ones left. They huddled together, their bodies trembling, their minds fraying at the edges. The clock ticked closer to 3:33 a.m., and the Midnight Man's form became more solid, more real. His hollow eyes locked onto Lily, and she felt a pull, a compulsion to step forward, to surrender. Chris grabbed her arm, pulling her back, but the shadows were already closing in. When the clock struck 3:33 a.m., the room was plunged into darkness one final time. When the light returned, Lily and Chris were gone. The basement was empty, save for a single piece of paper on the floor. It was old, yellowed, and smelled of decay. On it was written a new name, in blood. The Midnight Man had found his next player. The Midnight Game is not just a story. It's a warning. Every year, on the darkest night, someone finds the rules, scribbled on a piece of paper or posted on a shadowy corner of the internet. They gather their friends, light a candle, and knock on the door 22 times. They think it's just a game, a harmless thrill to chase away the boredom of life. But the Midnight Man is real, and he is always watching, always waiting. Those who play the game rarely survive, and those who do are never the same. They carry the shadows with them, a constant reminder of the horrors they witnessed. The whispers never leave them, and the cold touch of unseen hands lingers on their skin. They know the truth. The Midnight Man always wins. So if you ever find the rules, if you ever feel the temptation to play, remember this. Some doors should never be opened, and some games should never be played. Because once you invite the Midnight Man into your world, there is no escape. The game never ends. It only waits for the next player. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.